if you've been with us the last few months, we just finished a series going through the Shema, right, which is, according to Jesus, the most important command in the entire Bible. Right? Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. You shall love Yahweh your God with all of your heart, soul, and strength. We just finished a series walking through that word by word. And over the last few weeks, as I was trying to figure out where we were going to be going next, I kind of reflected on the stuff that I've had the opportunity to get to talk with y'all with. Right? Way back in August, we started going through 2 Timothy. And so we got to talk about the end of the Apostle Paul's life, and we got to talk a lot about the state of the early church, right, in the first century. And then we just spent a long time going through the Shema, which was a very Old Testament heavy series, right? We were talking a lot about the Old Testament story time and time again. And as I was reflecting on that, it made me feel like I was kind of dancing around the story of Jesus, right? Because we talked about the stuff after Jesus and we talked about the stuff before Jesus, but I haven't had an opportunity to talk with y'all about Jesus himself yet. And as I reflect on that more, I remembered that we had not yet finished our study through the Gospel of John, right? In January of last year, Pastor Rob kicked that off, and whenever he had me start leading 2 Timothy back in August, we'd gotten through chapter 10. And so I asked Pastor Rob's permission, and he gave me permission to continue on with that series. And so what today is going to be is really just a reorientation, and we're going to basically be recapping the stuff that we covered in John chapters 1 through 10, mainly because it's been about 7 or 8 months since then, right? And so I kind of want to just refresh us a little bit, and then we're going to hop into John chapter 11 next week. And so just so you know what to expect out of today, I'm wanting to just start off by reminding us about what sets the Gospel of John apart from the other Gospels. Then I want to just kind of recap the actual content of chapters 1 through 10, and then time permitting, I want to kind of reflect on what we've learned so far, right? Like what exactly John has tried to teach us in those 10 chapters, right? And so that last part, that's more of a time permitting thing, and if I don't get to it tonight, then I'll just kind of address it very briefly next week. But let's pray real quick, and then we will just hop right in. Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. Thank you for giving us the amazing privilege of getting to go through your word together. That's an amazing thing, God. And as we go into this gospel, which talks about your Son, Lord, I pray that you will set our hearts and our minds on him. And as we look to Jesus, we will come to rest in his goodness, and we will come to abide in you. We love you, God. We praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, so let's start off with the big question. What is it that sets the Gospel of John apart from the other Gospels? And the cool thing is that you can begin to answer this question simply by just looking at them very quickly, right? Because if you were to just breeze through and just skim read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you will notice that those Gospels look a lot like one another. They look so alike, in fact, that most people call them the synoptic gospels, which basically just means that they are by and large telling the story of Jesus from a similar point of view. In a second, we're going to talk about what even sets those apart. But by and large, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you're just reading them in that order, sometimes you might feel like you just read the same story 3 times. There are differences, but they're very similar. When you read the Gospel of John, though, you will notice that, if you put all 4 of them there, one of these is not like the other. Right? John is a very different gospel than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And according to our earliest traditions, John was the last of the gospels written, and in many ways, it seems like this gospel was supposed to serve as a supplement to the other 3, right? Whenever you actually read the gospel, it seems like John himself has this underlying expectation that the reader is somewhat familiar with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If they haven't read the Gospels themselves, maybe they're at least familiar with some of the stuff, because there are certain events in Jesus' life that John will reference in his Gospel that he doesn't actually detail in his Gospel, but you read about it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? So he kind of assumes that you're familiar with it, but at the same time, you can read John's Gospel without having ever read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you can still understand the main point. Right? And so in many ways, it's not like John thinks he's doing this whole new thing and introducing some strange, weird teaching. Well, no, it seems like they're supposed to be read hand in hand, right? Is that John enhances the reading of the other Gospels, but it also stands alone. And really, I think you could argue that with all of the 4 Gospels. The way that the early church fathers described the Gospel of John was as a quote-unquote spiritual gospel. And they don't exactly elaborate on what they mean by that, but I think if you read through it, you can kind of pick up on what they probably meant. Because what you'll notice is that when you read the Gospel of John, it doesn't cover nearly as many stories from a quantity perspective as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're very fast-paced, right? I mean, there are some times where you will see an entire story and it's like over the course of 5 verses, and then it just moves on to the next story. That's not quite what you see in the Gospel of John. Whenever you read the Gospel of John, it shares less stories from a quantity perspective, and the stories that it does share are much more drawn out and reflective. Right? To where in John, you're more likely to see some theological reflection, to where not only will he tell you what happened, but he'll begin to interpret what happened for you. And he'll begin to kind of explain that to you, to almost just like draw out the spiritual implications and say, hey, this is what's going on. And so where the synoptics give you a more rapid fire summary, John immerses you into the story itself. And one of the really cool things about the Gospel of John is that he actually tells you why he wrote the book, which is super useful. There's a few books in the Bible that do this, and I always love it because it makes it very easy as somebody who's trying to teach the Bible, because basically you let the author say, hey, this is why I'm writing it, and then whenever I'm teaching it, I just have to answer, how does what he's saying now contribute to his ultimate purpose, right? And if you go to the end of the Gospel of John, to the second to last chapter, John chapter 20, there are 2 verses where he just outright says why he wrote this book. He says this in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Right? So John says there are plenty of things I could have said about Jesus. And if John is the beloved disciple, right, one of the 12 disciples, one of the 12 apostles who was like best friends with Jesus, I mean, you can just imagine the stories he had to share, right? He says, there's plenty I could tell you about Jesus, but I'm not telling you everything. What I have chosen to put in this gospel serve the primary purpose of convincing you that Jesus is the Christ and teaching you how to believe in him as the Christ, the Son of God, in such a way as to have eternal life in his name. And so it seems like what John is saying is that there are 2 primary purposes of his gospel. The first one is that he is wanting to defend and demonstrate the identity of Jesus. Who is Jesus? And, what does it mean to be who he claimed to be, right? The second thing he's wanting to demonstrate is the nature of true belief, right? What does it mean to believe in Jesus? Because, you even see this to this day in our current culture. A lot of people say they believe in Jesus, but there's some people who say that, and you would be pretty surprised because you're like, really? Your lifestyle doesn't seem to demonstrate that. And so it seems like John's gospel is really focused on trying to demonstrate what does it mean to truly believe. And so from this perspective, there seem to be kind of 2 aspects and 2 end goals in the Gospel of John. One of them is apologetic in nature. And what I mean by apologetic is I do not mean that he is apologizing for Jesus. I'm using this as the theological term. Apologetic and an apology is a reference. It is a theological term meaning to defend your faith, right? And so there's an apologetic sense to this gospel in the sense of he is defending the faith of the earliest Christians. Right? He is saying this is what we believe about Jesus based off of who Jesus was and what he claimed. So there's a defending aspect to this. But then, on the second hand, there's also an evangelistic aspect to this. Not only is he defending the faith, but he also seeks to advance the faith. Right? His goal in this gospel, and he just says it for you, is he says, I want to teach you to believe in Jesus, and I want to show you what that means. And so, in John's ideal world, if there's anybody who does not understand who Jesus is, well, by the end of his gospel, they'll understand who he is. And if there's anybody who might know who Jesus is, but they don't yet believe in him, well, by the time they get to the end of his gospel, they will. And if they don't, it can't be out of ignorance, right? And so that really seems to be the primary thrust of John's gospel. And that's exactly what you see whenever you actually look into the text of the gospel itself. One thing that I like to do whenever I talk about the Gospels and really just like what exactly sets each gospel apart from one another is I like to look at how each gospel begins and how each gospel ends. Because usually, and this isn't just with books of the Bible, with pretty much any story that you're looking at, you can compare how the story begins and ends, and that will tell you a little bit about the story that was told in between. right? You can look at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring and look at the end of Return of the King, and you can kind of figure out what the overall goal of the Lord of the Rings story was, right? Because there's usually a problem set up at the beginning, and there's a solution at the end, and you might not know all the different things that happened in between, but you can figure it out as you go, right? Or the original Star Wars movie, right? The movie opens up with some weird spaceship, and this guy named Darth Vader shows up, and he's like searching for something, and it's a really terrifying scene, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. But then you look at the last scene, and it's like this award ceremony where all these valiant heroes are being rewarded and giving medals for somehow overthrowing this empire. Oh, and you realize, okay, well, it seems like this story is about a new hope being ignited in the galaxy, right? Because it started off with a really terrifying situation, and apparently those bad guys were overthrown, and now the story ends in victory. And then the next movie is whenever the bad guys kind of win, and so what's the next movie called? The Empire Strikes Back, right? And so if you compare the beginning and the end of stories, you can kind of figure out what the story's about. And so if you were to look at the Gospel of Matthew, you can see that Matthew's main focus is that he is trying to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messianic King who is the Son of David, right? And you can see this by just looking at the beginning and the end. The thing that Matthew starts off with is a genealogy, right? Because according to Jewish belief, you cannot be the Messiah unless you have the right bloodline. If you are not descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through Judah and through David, you're not the Messiah. And so you can't even begin to discuss Jesus being the Messiah if he doesn't have the right bloodline. Well, the way the Gospel of Matthew ends is with Jesus giving the Great Commission. And he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Well, that communicates that he's the Messiah, but not only does it communicate he's the Messiah, it communicates that the Messiah was way bigger than they ever expected, right? He's not simply an earthly king. He has all authority in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of the nations, right? So Matthew's main focus is Jesus, the Messianic King. Well, Mark's gospel is a little bit different. Mark's gospel, it doesn't tell us anything about Jesus' birth. It doesn't tell us about any genealogies. It just begins running just right off the bat with the ministry of John the Baptist. And by the time you get to the end of Mark chapter 1, Jesus is already famous and he is in his full-fledged ministry. Like, it doesn't waste any time. And then Mark's gospel ends very abruptly with Jesus resurrecting, and then it just ends. And women are fleeing, and it's like, whoa, that ended. And so what you see that Mark is emphasizing is that Jesus is the sacrificial servant and the Son of Man. Right? You don't really care where a servant comes from. You don't really care where a servant's going. You care about what a servant does. And so Mark is emphasizing the things Jesus did. It begins right whenever John the Baptist is announcing him, and it ends whenever Jesus finishes his work on earth. Right? And so Mark is primarily focused on action, and that's why it's the shortest gospel. Right? Luke, well, it begins with the announcement, not even of Jesus' birth, but John the Baptist's birth. So it starts with the announcement of a family member's birth, and then the gospel goes all the way through the ascension of Jesus, right? So it really starts where the earthly story of Jesus begins, whenever the angel Gabriel announces the birth of his cousin, and it ends whenever the earthly ministry of Jesus ends, right? Whenever he ascends up to heaven. And so Luke's gospel is emphasizing Jesus as the perfect man and the son of Adam. It's emphasizing his humanity, right? And it's a much more historian-focused aspect to the book, to the story of Jesus. And one thing I need to highlight here is that each of the four gospels agree that Jesus is the Messianic King, that he is the sacrificial servant, and that he is a man, right? They all agree on this, but each of them are emphasizing one over the other, right? Which then leads us to the Gospel of John, right? John is writing a little bit later, and if you want to just imagine that you are the Apostle John, you're trying to figure out what can I contribute to the story of Jesus that hasn't already been said? Right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke already do such a fantastic job. What can I do to truly tell the story of Jesus? And what John realizes he wants to emphasize, which the other gospels already talk about, is he wants to emphasize Jesus as the Word made flesh and the Son of God. Right? The fact that Jesus is the King, yes, and he is a servant, yes, and he is a man, yes, but he's also God in the flesh. And so as you're reflecting from John's perspective, he's like, where do I even begin to tell the story of God? And ultimately, there is no beginning to the story of God, right? Because, he's always existed. But the Old Testament started somewhere, so I guess that's the best place to start. And if you go to Genesis 1:1, it starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, John says, let's start there. John chapter 1, starting in verse 1, he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So whenever John starts telling the story of Jesus, he can't even call him Jesus yet, because Jesus is the name that he was given when he was born of a virgin. And so he calls him the Word, right? And there's this whole theological thing you could break down in regards to the Word. But ultimately what you see as you read through those opening verses of John is that the Word becomes flesh and dwells amongst man, right? And so John, he starts way back in the beginning where the Bible itself starts. And very quickly over the course of the first few verses, he gets us to the place where Jesus' ministry begins. And then if you go to the end of John's gospel, you can see that even once he's finished it, he realizes that there's still so much more story to be told, right? Because how do you end the story of God? There is no ending either. And so John chapter 21, this is what he says. "Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." I've always thought that is one of the most beautiful ways to end a book. And it's a very fitting way to end a book about Jesus. He says, man, there are so many more stories I wish I could tell you. John's saying, man, I spent 3.5 years with Jesus, and there's so much I want to say. But if I were to literally write it all down, there is not enough paper in the world. And so you'll have to be satisfied with this gospel that I've given, right? And so John realizes as he goes into his gospel that he's never going to be able to tell the full story, right? And in fact, later on, he's going to write the book of Revelation, which reveals a whole nother aspect of Jesus that he didn't even know whenever he was talking with Jesus face to face, right? And so John realizes that the gospel itself is very limited in scope, but he argues that it serves a purpose. And through this gospel, you are going to see who Jesus is and what exactly it means to be the Word made flesh, right? What does it look like for God to dwell amongst man, and what does it look like to believe in him? So let's walk through and recap what we saw in chapters 1 through 10. Like we already said, the way that the Gospel of John opens is with this 18-verse prologue, which is one of the most beautiful texts in the entire Bible. I already read a few verses of it for you. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. It's amazing, right? And just those 18 verses right there have so many theological truths that you could literally just soak it in and reflect on it for 10 weeks in and of itself. But then very quickly he moves on. And whenever you get to the back half of chapter 1, you really kind of get this continued introduction to who Jesus is. And in many ways, it's almost like a relay race with everybody passing the baton as everybody is trying to figure out who this Jesus guy is. So we open up with John the Baptist, which is pretty much where every gospel opens up, right? You really can't talk about Jesus without first talking about John the Baptist. And so you're introduced to John the Baptist, but John the Baptist sees Jesus, and very quickly, he tells 2 of his disciples about Jesus, and they go follow Jesus. And then one of those disciples, his name's Andrew, well, he goes and tells his brother Simon about Jesus, and now Simon goes to meet with Jesus, and Jesus changes his name to Peter. Well, Peter sees this stuff about Jesus, and Peter goes to tell somebody else, a guy named Philip, about Jesus, and so Philip goes to see Jesus. And then Philip, he's like, oh, I gotta go tell my friend Nathaniel. And so Philip goes and tells Nathaniel about Jesus, and now basically what you see is that one person after another is spreading the good news, right? And over the course of that chapter, Jesus is called by 7 different titles, all of which give you a little hint about who he is. He's called the Lamb of God. He's called the Son of God. He's called Rabbi. He's called Son of Man. He's called Messiah. He's called King of Israel. And he's simply called Jesus of Nazareth, right? And so really all of chapter 1 is a big introduction to who Jesus is. We get to see this amazing prologue immediately followed by all these people just saying, look at who Jesus is. He's super amazing. Come meet him. And then starting in chapter 2, the story gets rolling, right? We get these 2 stories. The first one is at a wedding. The second one is at a temple, right? At the wedding, Jesus performs his first miracle, right? He turns water to wine, and in that, we get to see his physical provision for the people. At the temple, we see Jesus start flipping tables, and we get to see the spiritual reformation that he's planning on bringing about. And as he goes throughout the temple, he's flipping these tables, and everybody's kind of shocked by this because, I mean, this is a holy place, and some random hillbilly from Nazareth just showed up and started flipping tables. They're noticeably shocked, and they say, whoa, how do we know that you have the authority to do this? Because he's going around saying, look at what you've done to my father's house. And they're like, whoa, your father? What, your father is God? Who are you to claim this, right? I mean, that's a big claim. How do we know that you are who you claim to be? And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. And they're confused by this because they think he's talking about the actual temple, but what he's talking about is his body. And so he says, you want to know that I am who I claim to be? Kill me and wait 3 days. If I stay dead, then I'm not who I claim to be. If I'm living again, then you're in for it. Right? And so chapter 2 gives us a really cool introduction to Jesus where we get to see the gracious provision of Jesus on one side at the wedding, and then we also get to see the very firm rebuking aspect of Jesus who has shown up to really reform the Jewish people and try to bring them back to God. And then when you go into chapters 3 and 4, you get to see 4 different interactions regarding people and how they view Jesus. And because I love to do this, I have formed an alliteration out of it. Right? You've got the rabbi, the radical, the recluse, and the royal, right? The first interaction we have is with a rabbi named Nicodemus, right? He shows up in chapter 3 because he wants to meet with Jesus, because he's heard some interesting things about Jesus and he just wants to know more about him. But what's interesting about this whole interaction is that by the end of it, you don't know where Nicodemus lands. Does he believe in Jesus? Does he not? We don't know. And Nicodemus shows up a few more times throughout the gospel, and it's not going to be until after Jesus' death that Nicodemus seems to finally choose a side, right? And so here you have this well-respected Jewish leader, and he's kind of ambiguous about Jesus. Well, then, the back half of chapter 3, you get to see the radical. And by this, I'm talking about John the Baptist. We return to radical John out in the wilderness, and we see that his disciples are getting kind of jealous about Jesus because Jesus is growing in popularity. And as he's growing in popularity, they're losing their popularity. And so they go to John and say, hey, what's the deal here? Your cousin's stealing all our thunder. And John says, he must increase, I must decrease. He says, yeah, that's the point. He says, I'm here to exalt Jesus. And so we kind of have a contrast there, right? Nicodemus, the well-respected leader, he's ambiguous about Jesus. John the Baptist, the radical dude living in the desert, he is all about Jesus. Well, then you go to chapter 4 and it gets even crazier because now we're going to have 2 interactions with people who aren't even Jewish, right? It starts off with Jesus interacting with a Samaritan woman in the middle of Samaria, right? And if you know anything about Jewish culture, they did not like the Samaritans, and there's this whole history behind it that we don't have to get into tonight. But Jews didn't like Samaritans, Samaritans didn't like Jews. But by the end of this whole interaction, Jesus reveals to this woman that he is the Messiah, the first person he ever directly tells this. And she believes, and she gets up and she is like running into the city and says, guys, I need to tell you about this man who told me everything I've ever done. Could he be the Christ? And now this is even crazier, right? So now you have this Jewish rabbi who is ambiguous about Jesus. You've got this Jewish radical guy who is all about Jesus. And now you've got this Samaritan woman who is really all about Jesus. And you're trying to figure out, like, what's the common denominator, right? How is it that somebody, like if anything, you would expect that Nicodemus would be the one who was most prone to follow Jesus because he was the most well-versed in the scriptures. But apparently that's not how it's going. And then at the end of chapter 4, you get to see Jesus perform a second miracle. And this miracle is performed for a royal official, a Gentile man, who asks for help for his son who is sick. And Jesus heals this man's son from a distance because this man had faith in him, right? And so if you're following with us, you've got a religious leader who kind of is ambiguous about Jesus, which if you're ambiguous, that kind of means that you're rejecting him for the time being. And then you've got an outcast named John the Baptist who is very happy about Jesus. You've got a Samaritan woman who would once again be considered an outcast by their standards, and she's all about Jesus. And then you've got a royal official who from a Gentile or a Roman perspective is really cool, but from a Jewish perspective is the enemy. Yet he's also really all about this Jesus guy. And so you're saying, this is interesting. Apparently people aren't responding to Jesus how we would naturally expect for somebody to reply to the Messiah. You go into chapters 5 through 10, and those 4 encounters with Jesus are followed by 4 different feasts that are very special to the Jewish people, right? You see a Sabbath, you see a Passover, you see a Feast of Tabernacles, and you see the Feast of Dedication. And there's going to be different interactions that happen at each of these feasts. On the Sabbath day, we get to see that Jesus offers true rest whenever he goes down to this invalid, this lame man at the pool of Bethesda, and he gives them the ability to walk after 38 years of not being able to walk. He says, get up and walk, and everything's good. Well, when you look at the rest of that chapter, it results in a very big confrontation wherein Jesus eventually declares that he is equal to the Father, which people don't like. And people begin to realize, oh, this is dangerous. And what we get to see about the invalid man is that he doesn't seem as grateful as he ought to be for what Jesus did for him. All right, well, whenever you get to John chapter 6, we get to see a Passover. And if you remember, the Passover in the Old Testament is a big celebration celebrating God's delivering the people of Israel out of Egypt during the Exodus, and God's provision of them with the sacrificial lamb to atone for their sins, and then the bread in the wilderness and all that stuff. Well, in John chapter 6, we get to see that Jesus offers true bread, where we actually get to see him perform two miracles here, back to back. In one, he feeds 5,000 men plus women and children at one time. And then immediately afterwards, he leaves because he knows that they're trying to make him king by force. And so he gets out of there, and he actually gets out by walking across the water. And so he walks across the water. There's another miracle. And whenever he gets to the other side, all the people get up and they follow him because they want to make him king. And this leads to another confrontation in the back half of chapter 6, where he rebukes them because he knows that they're not trying to make him king for the right reasons. They're not coming to him for him. They're coming to him because they like the free food, right? They like the miracles. They don't like the message as much. And so he gives a very hard sermon that actually runs a lot of them off. John chapters 7 through 10, a very long passage there, it details a bunch of, just a series of stories that take place during the Feast of Tabernacles. Right? The Feast of Tabernacles celebrates God's guidance of the people through the wilderness. And they would build these little shelters to live in to commemorate the shelters they lived in during their time period in the wilderness. And what we see in this section, chapter 7 through 10, is that Jesus offers true guidance, right? And he is able to guide the people in a way that the religious leaders at that time period were not able to do. And so at the beginning of this, in chapter 7, he says the great offer, he says, come to me, all who are thirsty, and drink. And as people see this, they begin to wonder, could this be the Christ? And whenever you get into chapter 8, you get to see the fascinating story about the woman caught in adultery, right? And they cast her before Jesus and say, should we stone her? And Jesus says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, right? And then they all depart. And then this leads to yet another confrontation. There's a lot of confrontations in the Gospel of John. And in this confrontation, in the back half of chapter 8, Jesus declares, I am the light of the world. The idea is that everybody's living in darkness until they see him. And he alone can guide them into the true light. And as he continues to talk to them, he says that if anybody follows me and they are one of his disciples, then they will know the truth, and the truth will set them free. And then the Jews respond and they say, freedom? We've never been slaves. How could you say that we need freedom? What are you talking about? And they get to this whole debate about Jewish history, which ultimately leads to them talking about Abraham, and Jesus starts making some claims about him and Abraham, and they say, how can you even say that you've seen Abraham's day when you're so young? To which Jesus responds and says, before Abraham was, I am. And he says, I might look like a 33-year-old dude, but I've been around for a lot longer. And he says, I was here way before Abraham. Well, they hear this, and obviously that's not a very small claim to make, and so they're wanting to kill him, right? And so what we see in John chapter 8 is that the tension is rising very severely, which then leads to John chapter 9, where Jesus performs yet another miracle. As he is fleeing for his life, he passes by a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples begin to ask questions about this man, which ultimately leads Jesus to healing the man that was blind from birth. Imagine that. You've never seen anything in your life, and for the very first time, you can see. And once again, surprise, surprise, this leads to a whole bunch of confrontations. And what ends up happening is that this man is brought before the Jewish leaders who are furious that Jesus would do such a thing, which is crazy because he's helping people out, right? But they feel their power is threatened, right? And so they begin rebuking this man, and they're asking him to recant his story. And personally, I love this story because the man is kind of sassy, right? Because they keep saying, hey, just tell us your story again, right? Tell us again, because they're trying to find a hole in his argument. And he finally responds and he says, I've told you this story so many times, you keep asking me to repeat it. What, do you want to become one of his disciples too? And the guy just begins to mock them. But as a result, this man is kicked out of the synagogue, which in that culture, that's like almost a death sentence, right? Because you're being excommunicated from your religious system, your family, all of this stuff. It was really bad. And so we get to see that following Jesus might cost you something, right? And it's not until after this that the man actually gets to see Jesus. Because whenever Jesus healed him, he actually told the man to get up and go wash in a pool. And after he washed in the pool, he could see. So the man hadn't even seen Jesus yet. And he doesn't get to see him until he's already suffered for Jesus' name, which is kind of cool. Which then leads to chapter 10, where we get to see the aftermath of this. And Jesus really begins to rebuke the religious leaders here because what they're doing is unacceptable, right? And so this is where we get some more I am statements from Jesus. He says, I am the gate of the sheep, right? He says that God has these sheep, and if these sheep want to enter the fold, they have to go through him, right? He's the door, right? He also says he is the good shepherd. Not only is he the one who lets the sheep into the fold, but he's also the one who guides the sheep, unlike these bad shepherds who are currently over them, the religious leaders who are leading them astray. And that all leads to, once again, Jesus making a very provocative statement where he says, I and the Father are one. A clear demonstration of him declaring himself to be equal with God, which leads to these verses in John chapter 10, verses 31 through 42. These were the final verses that we went through back in August. After he said, I am the Father and are one, the Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me? The Jews answered him, it is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said I am the Son of God? If I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Again, they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. He went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first, and there he remained. And many came to him, and they said, John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true. And many believed in him there. So that's where we left off in John chapter 10, right? Things have gotten so tense in Jerusalem that Jesus has had to withdraw, and he has separated himself. And currently, that's where we're going to pick up in John chapter 11. And as we go into John chapters 11 and 12, we are going to see Jesus have to return to the outskirts of Jerusalem. One of his very close friends who lives just outside Jerusalem is going to die. And Jesus is going to go there and resurrect him. And because he resurrects him, everybody's going to want to put Jesus to death. And so just so you know where we're heading for the rest of the Gospel of John, chapters 11 and 12 deal with the resurrection of Lazarus and the aftermath. And then as you go into chapters 13 through the end of the Gospel of John, we are dealing with the passion narrative of Jesus. The very thing that we're going to be celebrating really starting tomorrow, since today is Wednesday and Sunday is Easter Sunday, right? Whenever you get to chapter 13, we are dealing with the Last Supper, right? So Thursday night. And chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 into chapter 18 are all focusing on that one Thursday night where we are going to see Jesus sit down and share his final words with his followers. You get to chapters 18 and 19, and we go from his final words to his final hours. And we're going to see Jesus betrayed, arrested, and killed. But then you get to chapters 20 and 21, and that's the stuff we're going to be celebrating on Sunday, where Jesus doesn't stay dead. And that's why we're here today, right? If he stayed dead, we probably wouldn't be talking about this book, and the book probably wouldn't have been written. I can guarantee you it wouldn't have been written. But he didn't stay dead, and so that's why we're going to be going through this. And so there's a recap of it. Now, really quickly, and we might go a little bit over, so please forgive me, I want to talk about what we've learned so far, right? Because I said at the very beginning of this that John had two primary goals. He wanted to defend the identity of Jesus, and he wanted to demonstrate what it means to truly believe. And so I want to look at each of those very briefly just to see what we've seen. And so let's start with the identity of Jesus, right? Throughout the text, people have been wondering who Jesus is, and the narrative itself actually opened up with people wondering who John the Baptist was. If you go to John chapter 1, literally the opening words of the actual narrative of the story, a bunch of people come up to John the Baptist and they say, "Are you the Messiah?" He says, "No." "Are you the prophet?" He says, "No." "Are you Elijah?" He says, "No." "Who are you?" He says, "Oh, I'm just a voice in the wilderness, paving the way for the Lord." And so whenever people are asking who John the Baptist is, he says, that's not the question you need to be asking. You need to be asking, who is Jesus? And so that's what the rest of the book does, right? From that point forward, people aren't asking who John the Baptist is, they're asking, who is Jesus? And so as you read through it, that's what you see. John chapter 4, verse 29, I mentioned this earlier, the Samaritan woman, she runs into the distance saying, "Can this be the Christ?" Right? A few chapters later, John chapter 7, whenever the people are debating about who Jesus is, we read this. When they heard these words, some of the people said, "This really is the prophet." Others said, "This is the Christ." But some said, "Is the Christ to come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was?" So there was a division amongst the people over him. And then even a few chapters later, in John chapter 10, verse 24, the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." And so throughout the whole gospel, we have seen people wondering, who is Jesus? Samaritans are wondering about this. His followers are wondering about this. Enemies are wondering about this. Everybody wants to know, who is this guy? And the cool thing is that Jesus actually starts giving us some answers throughout the gospel, right? John chapter 5, verse 18, we read, "This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." This is one thing that some more skeptical people in the modern day will miss out on, because they'll argue that the earliest Christians didn't believe that Jesus was God. Well, that's kind of hard to make sense of, given that his enemies seem to sure recognize that, right? I mean, right here, the reason they want to kill him is because they realize what he's saying, right? When he says, "I and the Father are one," they know what that means. And so they see that Jesus, in addition to claiming to be the Christ, he's claiming to be God in the flesh, which is not something they expected. In John chapter 10, verse 30, I already read this one earlier, he says, "I and the Father are one." Once again, he's reaffirming not only is he the Christ, not only is he the King, not only is he the servant, not only is he a man, he is one with the Father. He is God in the flesh. And in other instances, Jesus will use the phrase "I am" to convey who he is. And we've talked a lot about this in our studies of the Old Testament. "I am" is a phrase that is closely associated with the name of God, right? So you can use the phrase "I am" in a very simple manner, but whenever you're a controversial figure like Jesus, and you're using the phrase "I am," you know exactly what you're doing, right? Whenever the people of Israel call their God the great I am, and you're going around saying, "I am blank," you know what you're doing. And so John chapter 4, verse 26, when he's talking with the Samaritan woman, she asks him, she says, when the Messiah shows up, he'll tell us all these things. And he says, "I am," right? In English, we have to put the word "he" in there just to help make sense of it. He says, "I am he," but in Greek, it's "I am," right? I am the Messiah, right? John chapter 8, verse 28, Jesus uses the phrase to identify himself as the Son of Man. "I am." John chapter 8, verse 58, I already referenced this one earlier. "Before Abraham was, I am." Oh, that one always gives me chills every time. I've gotten chills twice tonight just saying it. In addition to this, he has a lot of "I am" statements, right? John chapter 6, verse 35, "I am the bread of life." John chapter 8, verse 12, "I am the light of the world." John chapter 10, verse 7, "I am the gate of the sheep." John chapter 10, verse 11, "I am the good shepherd." There's going to be more "I am" statements, but we haven't gotten there yet, so I don't want to spoil them, even though the book's been out for 2,000 years. And so we've seen everybody wondering, who Jesus is, and we've seen Jesus himself declare who he is, and he has declared that he is nothing less than God in the flesh. And the cool thing is that in the very first chapter, this is exactly what the author himself told us. John chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so if you're reading through the Gospel of John and you come to any belief other than Jesus is God in the flesh, then you have misunderstood the Gospel of John, right? Because that's the thing that he's emphasizing, right? All of the Gospels teach that Jesus is God, but that is the main thing that John is trying to convey, right? He is placing a huge emphasis on this because he's saying there's no doubt about it, right? And so if your theology does not allow for Jesus to be God, well, then we need to talk, because that's what the Bible teaches. But then I also said that the Gospel of John is focused on the nature of true belief. This is really the main application of it, right? It's trying to teach you what it means to believe in Jesus. And what I really love about the Gospel of John is that a lot of the stories he chooses to tell serve the purpose of contrasting true belief versus false belief. And you see this in John chapter 2, remember when you have the wedding in the temple, right? Because in both stories, you hear about people believing in Jesus, right? In John chapter 2, verse 11, you read, "This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him." Right? So we see that Jesus turns water to wine, and everybody sees this, and they come to believe in him, and they begin to follow him. Well, if you go to the end of that chapter, after Jesus starts flipping tables and stuff, and he starts performing even more miracles, we read this in verses 23 through 25. "Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man." Just another thing right there, I just want to highlight. It says that Jesus didn't need anybody to tell him what they believed because he already knew what was in their hearts. Well, if you're talking about Old Testament theology, man looks to the outward appearance, the Lord looks to the heart. So once again, if somebody says that the Bible doesn't teach Jesus is God, there it is. But more importantly here, you see a contrast, right? The people at the wedding and the people at the temple both saw Jesus perform miracles. And the Bible tells us that both believed in him. But one of their beliefs were genuine and one was not, right? The people at the wedding, they believed in him. And it doesn't really tell us what that belief looks like, because I think John's allowing that tension to hang in there, right? We're supposed to keep wondering, what does it mean to truly believe? But we do get to see why the people at the temple did not genuinely believe. And it's because Jesus knew what was in their hearts. And so what we can say at the very least is that belief is not simply like cognitive, right? It is not simply agreeing that Jesus can do miraculous things, because both people agreed on that, right? Both people saw Jesus performing miracles and both believed in him. So it's not simply a knowledge thing. It's not simply saying, I believe Jesus can perform miracles. It's got to go deeper than that. And then if you keep reading, you see that some of the stories are contrasts, right? John chapter 3 versus John chapter 4. You've got you've got Nicodemus, the well-respected Jewish man, versus the unnamed, disrespected Samaritan woman. Well, Nicodemus over here, we don't even know where he lands by the end of the story. And if anything, he's leaning towards skepticism. But the Samaritan woman, she does believe, right? And so I think what John's telling us to do is he wants us to contrast those. And he wants us to look at what is it about Nicodemus that's hindering him from buying into this Jesus thing? And what is it about this Samaritan woman that is helping her buy into it, right? And then you see the same thing whenever you compare the story of Jesus healing the invalid at the pool of Bethesda, right? Versus the blind man who was blind from birth, right? Because both of them are healed by Jesus, and then both of them have a response to Jesus, and then both of their responses result in a confrontation between Jesus and the religious leaders. And whenever you look at the invalid, you get to see that he was healed, but very shortly after that, he hands Jesus over to the religious leaders. It seems like all he wanted from Jesus was the healing, right? And he gets healed, and then he just moves on, and he doesn't really seem that grateful. Whereas the blind guy, well, it turns out he could see better than anybody else, because even before he had seen Jesus face to face, he was willing to suffer reproach for Jesus. And so you have this contrast, and you get to see, okay, well, apparently believing in Jesus is not simply receiving healing, right? It goes deeper than that. It is being willing to bear the name of Jesus even if you have to suffer, right? And so you have that contrast. Whereas the lame guy, the invalid, he wasn't willing to do that, right? The religious leaders came talking to him, and he's like, Jesus healed me, go talk to him, right? He's like, nope, I'm just the messenger, go to him. Whereas the blind guy was like, no, this guy healed me. I was blind, but now I see, right? And so once again, you have this contrast. And then my favorite part, and this is where I'm going to end, is John chapter 6, right? I think this is probably the place where John most emphasizes what it means to truly believe. Because this is, once again, the story where Jesus feeds the 5,000. And in that story, we read in verse 15 that the people wanted to take him by force and make him king. But then we read that Jesus withdrew from them. And we read in verse 24, even though they got into boats and went to Capernaum seeking him, he rebuked them. Which is weird, because if you just look at this at face value, it looks like the people are doing all the things correctly, right? I mean, they believe in him. They want to make him king. Whenever he moves somewhere else, they pack up their things and follow. I mean, that sounds like discipleship if I've ever seen it, right? I mean, that's what we should all want to do, right? We all want to make Jesus king. We all want to believe in him. We all want to follow him wherever he goes. Yet that story doesn't end with Jesus saying, thank you so much for your faith. Instead, he rebukes them. And this is what he says in verse 26. He says that they were seeking him not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. So from an outsider's perspective, it looked like they were disciples through and through. They wanted to make him king, and they would have, if there was a Sunday service, man, they would be sitting in here and they would be saying, Jesus is king. Right? And they would be saying, Jesus can provide for all my needs. And they would believe it, right? They'd experienced it. But according to Jesus, that's not the faith he was looking for. Because he didn't want people who were following him for what he had to provide. He wanted people who were following him because of him. The cool thing is that if you follow him for him, you do get what he provides. But there's a distinction to be made. Genuine belief is about the giver, not about the gift, right? It's not simply about getting to go to heaven. It's about getting to be with Jesus, right? It's not simply about having all the love and joy and peace that you could ever want. It's about getting to know Jesus, right? It's about him, and the gifts are secondary, right? Those are amazing gifts of grace that we receive, but that's not what it's about. It's always got to be about him. And that's going to be what the Gospel of John's about, right? That's what we sang about at the very beginning of this, right? It's about abiding in Jesus. Not abiding in all the different gifts that he has to give us and all the luxuries of being a Christian. Is about abiding in him. And even when your life is falling apart, learning to be satisfied in him alone, right? That's what it means to genuinely believe. And that's what we've seen in chapters 1 through 10. But I have taken up more of your time than I intended to. And so I'm going to pray us out here. And next week, we'll pick up, Lord willing, with John chapter 11. And we will see Jesus on the way to go raise his friend from the dead. Lord, thank you so much for giving us your word. Thank you for all the things that you're doing in the world, the things that we know about and the things we don't know about, God. I thank you for every single person in this room and anybody who might be watching online, God. I pray that you will be with them as we depart this place, that you will keep them safe, and that you will help strengthen their faith, God, and you will help them to genuinely believe in who you are and live out that belief day by day. We love you, God. We praise you. To your name we pray. Amen.